Good afternoon, Santa Clarita Valley. You're on the Legal Line with Dennis Kennelly. Welcome. We will get to him in a little bit, but our special guest today, and he's a very special guest, is a prominent, and I mean prominent, estate planning and tax lawyer, Richard A. Dick Block, who's not only a friend of mine, but he's also my estate planning lawyer. So I entrust my assets to him, and he's got some great advice for everybody. I think it's we're going to really have a lot of fun with that. Flying solo today, my normal producer, Laura Espinoza, is of London Rain, and Nikki London are both working on our opening karaoke project tonight at Sarah's on Ventura Boulevard. So with me is my trusty engineer, Justin Powell, and Dick Block, who we'll get to in a minute. Just want to talk about some items in the news that impact all of us. First thing is, it just came over the wire that the House of Representatives narrowly, and I mean narrowly, passed the Republican version of the replacement for Obamacare, which is still not as clear as we'd like it. But I haven't bothered to read it yet because it is going to be absolutely dissected, torn apart, and rewritten in the House-Senate conference because the Republicans have a substantial majority in the House of Representatives and still had to squeak it by. They have a 2-vote majority in the Senate, so there are going to be some changes made, as the old saying goes and as the song goes. Second thing, closer to home, we had the Writers Guild settle with the production companies in the studios. And that was very, very important because the 10 years ago was the last contract negotiation they had, the two parties had. And it resulted in a 100-day strike, which paralyzed the television and movie industry out here, and also cost the economy. The estimates were $20 million a day, and that's a lot of money. I mean, I think there are 2,000 or 2,500 people who were affected, who are actually union members and members of the Writers Guild, but if the movie industry and the TV industry shut down, a whole lot of other people are out of work at that time. So I am glad that the thing was settled. I don't know when the ratification vote is. I would imagine it's either this weekend or early next week. So that was good news for everybody. The interesting thing about those negotiations, the last contract was 10 years long. That is highly unusual. And actually, it's a real benefit for management, not labor, because labor thought they bought labor peace, which is nice, and security. But the industry, if you look at the changes in the entertainment industry over the last 10 years, and they were absolutely blocked out from renegotiating their contract. So they had a lot of issues they had to deal with, the Writers Guild, and apparently they got it done or got most of it done. So congrats to the parties on both sides for being labor statesmen. I enjoy that. With me is my good friend, and he is my good friend, Richard A. Dick Block. He is an estate planning and tax lawyer in beautiful Woodland Hills, California. Dick, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you, Dennis.
And I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to ask you some questions, but why don't you give us some of your background?
Well, I am primarily a tax lawyer, and of course, estate planning involves taxation. I am a Harvard-educated lawyer. After I graduated law school, I worked for the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C.
The enemy.
Well, it's sometimes a good idea to infiltrate the enemy and know where they're coming from. There is, when you say the enemy, there is a true story that I think sets forth very clearly what the state of mind of the IRS is. One day after I had worked for them for almost 4 years, I was in my office and I had a misdirected phone call. The voice on the other end said, "Hello, is this the Humane Society?" Without a moment's hesitation, Dennis, I answered, "Hardly. This is the Internal Revenue Service." But a lot has changed since then. I do have a master's in taxation law from Georgetown Law Center. I have taught taxation law at the University of Laverne and as an adjunct professor for several years, and I am certified as a taxation law specialist by the California State Bar Board of Legal Specialization. So that's a little bit of my background.
And you've been practicing over 40 years.
And I have still to get it perfect.
I'm still working on it too. I'm reminded when we talk about the estate planning aspects of this of my law professor who taught me estate planning in law school at Duke, the late Bertel M. Sparks, who was a Kentucky gentleman. He had been with the OSS during World War II, where he had won 2 Silver Stars. And he told his class at the start of estate planning, at the start of Trust and Estates, they used to let me teach estate planning here, but they don't allow me, meaning the law school higher-ups, they don't allow me to teach it anymore because on the subject of the estate tax, I get very, very emotional. So I'm dedicating this show to Bertel. I loved him dearly. He taught us a lot, and he was a great human being. So let's start off with the fact that I am aware that at least as I was growing up and talking to my friends, very few of my friends, even some who had a lot of money, had bothered to talk about estate planning, because I have found that younger people are very hesitant about doing it because it involves considering their own death. And nobody likes to talk about that. We all think we're immortal. But just to let people know, estate planning is the last opportunity that you get before you die to determine what happens to your assets after you're gone. Because if you don't do any estate planning, as Dick's going to tell you, there are all sorts of other people that are going to get involved in this, and you may not like the result. So, Dick, why don't you tell us, first of all, what happens if you die without having done any estate planning?
If you die without having at least a will, the assets pass whatever you've accumulated by what is called intestate succession. Now, under California rules, intestate succession differs depending on whether you have a spouse at the time of your death. If you have community property, and let me step back a second. Community property is property acquired by the efforts of either spouse during the marriage. In other words, if you inherit money from your parents while you are married, that is your separate property. If you had property before you got married, that is your separate property, with an exception that I'll just mention in a moment. But all other property is community property, and it is possible for the spouses to take property that is separate property and convert it into community property during the marriage, and vice versa. community property in the case of intestate succession, the decedent's 1/2 share goes 1/2 to his spouse, and the other 1/2 of the 1/2 goes in accordance with the other rules of intestate succession. So let's assume, in the worst scenario, the husband is unfortunately killed while a divorce action is pending. The spouse, the surviving spouse, will get 3/4 of the entire estate. If there is no spouse, or the if there is no spouse, or we're dealing with the remaining property after the spouse gets her share, then that passes first to the decedent's children, each taking equally. If there are no children, and the parents of the decedent is living, then it passes to them. If there is no surviving issue, no surviving parent, then it goes to a sibling.
Brother or sister.
A brother or sister of the decedent. And so on and so forth to more collateral heirs.
Okay, what happens if there are no heirs? I mean, you go all the way down through the list, and there are no cousins or uncles or anybody like that. Who gets it?
The state.
So, and what do they do with it? Good question. Okay, so ultimately, if you don't, depending on your family situation, you could wind up giving everything that you have, figuring that maybe you weren't married, so you didn't have a spouse, you didn't have any children, you didn't have any living relatives. If you die without a will, you could wind up giving everything that you had at the time of your death to the government.
That is correct.
And you can't do a damn thing about it because you're dead. So, okay. Now, we've all heard about estate taxes. How and when do they come into play?
Very rarely these days, and perhaps not at all in the future. California used to have an inheritance tax, which it imposed regardless of the estate tax. Also, the estate tax provided a credit for state death taxes, so that the state of California, in addition to the inheritance tax, would collect the amount that was a credit under the federal estate tax. California no longer has an inheritance tax, and there is no longer any estate tax collected by the state of California.
Now, how about our good friends with the federal government? Is there a federal estate tax as we speak?
There is a federal estate tax as we speak, and the trend over the last number of years has been to make it applicable only to larger and larger and larger estates. At the present time, in the case, there is a $5 million exemption from the federal estate and gift tax. It's a combined extension. When there is a spouse and the estate is drawn up properly by the attorney, up to $10 million can be exempted from tax.
But that's only if you set up a trust, correct?
Well, you could do it by will also, but a trust makes it much easier. President Trump has proposed to do away with the estate tax, which would simplify the tax law immensely, and contrary to the cries of certain people, would not impact the federal government to any significant extent. As a matter of fact, in my opinion as a tax lawyer, since every estate tax return filed must be audited, the cost to the government of those audits probably exceeds the amount of money collected by the federal government in estate tax. For example, I did a little research, Dennis, and in the latest statistics available from 2015, the federal estate tax constituted 5.5 thousandths of the federal taxes collected.
Boy, that's a lot lower than I would have thought.
0.0055.
That's amazing. I want to remind our listeners, you are very, very important to us, and we value your questions. So if you want to talk to Dick Block or myself, feel free to call in at area 661-298-5487. That's 298-KHTS. Or you can email us at dennis@hometownstation.com. And we're coming up on a break in about 2 minutes. So, Dick, I'm going to ask you one more thing, and then we'll get back to where we were now. And that is, you've indicated that how small a percentage the estate tax plays in the overall federal revenue scheme. I would note that the advice you're getting from Dick today, or the information, could be very, very valuable to you. If those of you that watch The Sopranos, Tony Soprano was played by James Gandolfini. James Gandolfini, smart as he was in the television show, was not too fiscally smart and died without any estate planning. And obviously, he had a lot of money because The Sopranos made a lot of money, and the estate is going to make a lot of money from the reruns. And without any estate planning, obviously his estate was worth more than $5 million. And he got killed, or his estate got killed, Dick. He wound up giving up almost 60%. The estate wound up paying almost 60% of the estate's value to the government. So this is important stuff. And with the value of real estate in California, a $5 million estate is a lot easier to come by than you might think. So listen, prepare, and no one wants to think about death, especially their own. But this is your last chance in terms of you. If you want to determine what happens to your money when you go and not see it go to the government to do God knows what, this is what you've got to do. We're coming up to our break right now. We'll be back after these messages. You're on the Legal Line with Dennis Kennelly, and get your dialing fingers ready because the phone number is 661-298-5487, and we're ready to take all your questions.